Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. With the arrival of Donald Trump in the White House, the various factions fighting Syria's proxy war are also on the move. Western-backed rebels are in retreat, and continued Washington support is unlikely. Is this conflict coming to an end? To CrossTalk Syria, I'm joined by my guest, Kamal Alam in London. He is a fellow at the Institute for Statecraft and a Syrian military analyst. In Beirut, we have Martin Jay. He is a freelance broadcast journalist. And in Washington, we cross to Ivan Elan. He is a senior fellow and the director of the Center on Peace and Liberty at the Independent Institute. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Martin, let me go to you first in Beirut. You know, if you look at every single capital that is around the world that is involved in this conflict in Syria, you see something very different. We see in Washington possibly stepping back under Trump presidency. In Syria, it's of Damascus. They see that they're winning in East Aleppo. The Turks, well, we can talk about that. They seem to want to work with Russia, but they seem to have their own agenda again. Then, of course, we have all the Gulf countries watching nervously. And we see the Europeans and the Americans maybe parting because we have a country like France saying something must be done, the usual mantra. I mean, is this something that is pushing some kind of resolution to this conflict?
I don't know how far we are away from a resolution. We've seen, you said it in your introduction, we seem to be reaching an end point. There seems to be an end game in sight if all the major geopolitical players can agree on how Aleppo is taken and who takes what. So in terms of solutions, I think certainly the European Union and the EU countries are not there. They're not standing up to rising up to the challenge of actually producing any sort of policy which will work with the Assad regime or keep the Saudis or Iranians happy. What we've got to look at now, and I think the French minister said this yesterday or the day before, is look at the humanitarian situation, which could be a catastrophe in the next few days or few weeks. So that needs to be a priority. But also, I think the players need to maybe talk to each other a bit more so we avert a new, fresh political crisis. And, you know, let's not forget, there is a rush on. All players in this conflict, even well, I should say especially some of these hardcore Sunni extremist groups, don't want to be looking at each other and scratching their heads come January the 20th. Exactly. When possibly they might not even have any money or arms from the Americans.
You know, Kamal, it's very interesting here is that I get the sense that Moscow and Ankara see an opening where they can actually apply much more pressure because the situation in the U.S. is very fluid. The Europeans are not strong enough. They're only rhetoric here. But, you know, we have Russia and Turkey. It's a very strange, complicated relationship. Can they go it alone and push the Americans and the Europeans off the negotiating table?
I think absolutely. The one deciding factor that could end this war is the relationship between Turkey and Russia. And the Syrian government has said for the last many years that the main problem they see in this war has been Turkey's attitude towards this war. Whether for good or for bad, Turkey has been a massive factor for what's happening in Syria right now. And there can be no endgame without Turkey coming into some kind of agreement with Damascus and Moscow on how to bring this conflict to an end. Because the Americans, they seem to be very confused to what's going on. By the time a new president is elected, you know, a lot of stuff would have happened by then. The Europeans are just side players. They're almost like little children who will make a lot of noise and throw all the, you know, toys out of the pram, but they can't actually do stuff. And they expect everyone else to carry that burden. And this is something President Obama said, that, you know, he's had enough of the freeloading. He said this about David Cameron in Libya. He said the same thing about the Europeans in Afghanistan. It was all about the Americans in Afghanistan. The Europeans didn't pull their weight. And there's a similar thing happening in Syria right now. The Europeans talk a lot, but actions, you know, their actions are limited, and those actions are often very negative.
Ivan Elan, let me go to you in Washington. You know, sometimes talk is more powerful than actions because we hear from Donald Trump that he may want to take a different course, meaning no course, maybe in a way, when it comes to Syria. How do you think the players in the region are reacting to that, and particularly the rebels, or what I call terrorists? How do you think they're going to react to that? Go ahead.
Well, I think they're probably going to try to get their funding and weapons from other people. Yeah. And I don't think Aleppo will probably fall, eastern Aleppo, but I'm not sure that the war is going to be over. And if the U.S. leaves, I think there are other countries in the region have have an incentive to push back against Iran and the Assad regime and Russia. So I think the conflict and probably go to an insurgency war. And, I'm not sure. Assad is still very weak, and he has to be, supported by Russian air power and Hezbollah and other forces on the ground, militias. So how long are those going to stay around? And there's still groups on the other side that are quite potent and quite nasty, actually.
Okay, well, Martin, react to what we just heard there, because, I mean, a lot of people say that Aleppo is a tipping point. It's a very important city in Syria, even though it's been almost completely destroyed. And it does send a signal about the balance of power in this conflict here. And it shows that the staying power of Assad in Damascus.
Yeah, I think Aleppo is a tipping point, and I think what Ivan said earlier is quite correct. I don't think it's the ultimate tipping point. Just when Aleppo falls, it doesn't mean that the Syrian war will be wrapped up conveniently on the same day. We may well find a new war emerging, because so far up until this point, we've seen very much a polarized setup in Syria. That polarization might end, and things might get even more complicated. Turkey was mentioned before. We seem to have a problem with the Turks. I mean, I was on the phone today to a very close advisor to President Erdogan, who was telling me that they're very concerned that a previous deal struck with Mr. Erdogan and Mr. Putin in Russia earlier this year in St. Petersburg seems to not quite correspond with the gameplay, with how things are working out in eastern Aleppo now. So the Turks have got themselves into a tight corner. They're trying to push the boundaries of geopolitical relationships beyond the norm and try and have it both their way, having their cake and eat it. On the one hand, they want to be great friends with Russia, which is completely logical, makes sense geopolitically and financially in terms of business. But on the other hand, they want to carry on with this loathing and hatred of the Assad regime, probably egged on by their Gulf Arab partners. I wonder how long that relationship can continue. I wonder how long this farcical situation can go on for them.
Kamal, can you address that? Because I think that's a very interesting point here. Because in a way, Turkey is damned if it does and damned if it doesn't, and it's going to have to choose eventually here. I have to tell you, here in Russia, looking at the Turkish president, a lot of people are very confused. Some are not very hopeful, and others just have a wish list, but nothing concrete. And it seems a lot of it focuses in on what Turkey's attitude eventually, solidly, will be.
I think the main problem for Turkey is that now they're completely embroiled in a massive domestic war. They started the war in Syria to try to topple the government there. They failed to do that, but the backlash that came was a massive terrorist backlash against them. And so their main concern is their own agenda, and that's what drives their Syria policy now. It started off by doing regime change. It's moved away from regime change, although they're still saying it's regime change, but they're limited how much they can do that. So it's all about the Kurdish question, it's about ISIS, it's about al-Nusra, and also to a very nuanced effect, their new relationship with the Gulf countries. Turkey's never been an easy partner of Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And as you know, the UAE and Turkey don't get along at all. Qatar do. There's a lot of money pouring into Turkey from Doha. Turkish have opened a military base in Qatar, which is the first time since the Ottoman Empire the Turks have opened a military base in an Arab country. So that is, I think, also a message to perhaps America to say that they will increase their involvement if the Americans retreat. So I think that's something to contend with. One thing Turkey have realized is they cannot mess with Russia. They tried it. They tried with the rhetoric. They've taken a complete U-turn against Russia in the last 6-7 months. They need Russia for their own domestic consumption, for their tourism. There are, I think, close to 500,000 Turkish citizens that are married to Russians as well. So there's a lot at stake. Turkish economy cannot survive without the Russians. At the end of the day, economy has a massive thing to do with it, and they have to work with the Russians.
Ivan, how much is the Erdogan worried about Trump? Because, again, Trump is very much an unknown quantity here. U.S.-Turkish relations are not the best right now. Is the inaugural date something that's on Erdogan's mind right now, and maybe push him to some kind of resolution on how he's going to finally approach Syria?
Well, I think the U.S. inauguration is on a lot of people's minds, not only Turkey, but Russia and the other players involved here. I think they would like to create a fait accompli in eastern Aleppo, and I think Turkey is also reacting to the inauguration as well. But to go back to the other point, if you think the fall of East Aleppo is a turning point, you might use the analogy, it's an imperfect one, of the Vietnam War, where the U.S. beat back the Tet Offensive in 1968. So, you know, the war went on, and it looked like it was going to end, or at least favorably to the U.S., but then, of course, it didn't over the long haul. So I think this is going to be a long war. And ultimately, I don't think Syria or Iraq, they're artificial countries. They always have been. And it's like Humpty Dumpty. You can't put the pieces back together again. They're going to have some decentralization or even partition of these two countries, or you're still going to have a problem, because these governments, they're often sometimes minority, sometimes majority, but it doesn't matter. The one group controls the government and tries to oppress the other groups, and as long as that central government has power, and the international community doesn't want a decentralized solution. So I think the conflict is going to go on. But you have to have decentralization, because one group will always think the other side is going to oppress them, and probably with some validity. So
okay, all right, gentlemen.
Until that happens, you're going to have a mess.
I'm going to jump in here, gentlemen. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Syria. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing Syria before the Trump presidency. Can I go back to Martin in Beirut? Ivan Eland was talking about history in the Vietnam War and perceptions of victory and defeat. But, you know, one thing is very interesting, and I think it's psychologically very important. I have heard from reports here in Moscow that there's additional pressure on Assad to liberate all of Aleppo before Trump becomes president, because it creates some kind of fact on the ground. And it's very psychological, too, because you'll have Obama leaving, and you have this, if anything, a psychological victory for the Assad government. And that sticks, okay? And that does create a message, and it does create an important perception. Go ahead.
But I think wars do have important milestones along their timeline, and Aleppo may well be one of them. There is a push, I think, from all sides to see if we can wrap this thing up, or at least contain a great deal of it and move forward before Donald Trump takes office. I mean, Trump is as much as a wild card as Erdogan is, you know, and potentially just as unpredictable and just as dangerous. You know, we've looked at a lot of Trump's own promises, his own election promises. He seems to be breaking one after the other, and journalists are having a field day with that. Fake news journalists or real ones. So, you know, we don't really know what Trump is going to do about the Middle East. I think it's encouraging that we've heard positive signs, I think yesterday and today in the press, that he wants to work closely with Putin. He wants to create a new relationship. I'm personally very excited about that. I think that a new world order made up of America and Russia tackling huge problems around the world and working together in a much more pragmatic, much more intelligent post-Cold War era it would be the way forward. I think that's smarter. And if you look at the Middle East, a lot could be done if both of those huge power blocks got together around the table and resolved Syria overnight. Now, where that places, interestingly, where that places the European Union, which doesn't really have a foreign policy unless you count what it writes in press releases and what
it doesn't have
140
it doesn't have a security
in the last couple of years.
It doesn't have a security policy as well. Okay, it's really quite extraordinary. Anyway,
it doesn't really have anything.
Yeah,
it's just got a lot of MEPs who talk a lot in Brussels. But does that? Let me just finish. Does that create a new relationship for the EU as a third and very servile player to follow what America and Russia could do. I mean, what could they possibly do? Perhaps offer translation services?
Okay, well, Martin, you're definitely bringing up a topic for another program, and I will tap you for that. Let me go to Kamal here. We will have a new president in the United States. He's untested. He said some things. He gives us an idea of what he might be thinking. What would you like to see Trump do vis-a-vis the Middle East here? And it can be a wish list, okay? And I won't hold it against you, okay? Because I'm very pessimistic that the foreign policy establishment won't give him much room. Go ahead, Kamal in London.
No, definitely. I think the most important thing is the men that Donald Trump surrounds himself with. There are a bunch of names flying around. There are at least 3 generals that they're talking about. Probably the most important general is General Mike Flynn. Now, as you know, General Mike Flynn is a realist. He traveled to Moscow last year, and at the same time, he's been very open of his criticism of the American policy in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in Syria. He even went as far as to say that perhaps the chemical weapons attack was a false flag attack. That's a big thing for the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency and one of the best American generals to say. The wish list is that Trump has said very clearly he wants to put America first. That means he said very clearly it's not in America's interest to go on building other countries, because it's not for America to build Iraq or America to build Libya, Afghanistan, and Syria. So if he's given room to do that, that would mean America will not be isolationist, but at the same time, they will not interfere as aggressively as they had in the past. Of course, that's one side of thing. Depending on who becomes Secretary of State or Defense Secretary, that could also go the other way, where there are some hawks who want to interfere even more. So I think there could be contradictions within the administration, but there are enough people, including Walid Faris, who's one of his Middle East advisors, who's of Lebanese Christian heritage, who believes that the outscale slaughter of Arab Christians by the hands of so-called allies needs to stop. And I think so. That's one of the things. They need to see the Middle East as not just a Muslim Middle East, but a massive Christian population. And the Christian population at the moment are being defended by the Syrian government and the Russians. And there are a lot of people in the American administration that want to look out for the Arab Christians as well. And I think that is something that is also a wish list for Donald Trump, to look at the Middle East not just as a Muslim Middle East, but you have a very, very varied Arab Christian population, which is actually the world's oldest Christian population.
Ivan, you know, you're in Washington. You know, my greatest worry is that there could, I mean, look what happened to Barack Obama, you know, a liberal Democrat. He surrounded himself with neocons, and we have a catastrophe of 8 years, particularly in the Middle East here. I mean, do you think or hope that Trump and his inner circle will learn from that mistake? We don't need a repeat of the last 8 years.
The problem that you have here, and it happens with every administration, is especially people who haven't been focused on foreign policy like Obama, George W. Bush, and now Trump, is that you have all these positions to fill, and they get the same old people because they don't know who to turn to. And so there is going to be some of that, I think. Now, Flynn, I think, is an encouraging pick because traditionally, although the Secretary of State position has great prestige, it doesn't have many resources associated with it. The powers that be are usually the National Security Advisor and the Defense Secretary, because the Defense Secretary has so many more resources than the State Department. And of course, a lot of times, you know, at the beginning, the State Department has influence, but as administrations go on, because the U.S. president has become so powerful relative to the other branches of government, foreign policy is usually done out of the White House. If you remember Kissinger versus William Rogers, who was an empty seat at State. In Carter, you had Brzezinski, who was very anti-Soviet, against Vance, who has the much more prestigious position of Secretary of State. Who won? Brzezinski did. So I think you're going to see eventually the power will and Trump has put loyalists around in the White House, and I think to some extent, and I think that's a good move on his part. So, of course, you have to fight the bureaucracies, and the bureaucracies are also very resistant to change. So, yes, change is still going to be difficult, but I think, you know, Flynn might be a good pick, and I think he's absolutely right. We have to have a better relationship with Russia, and I don't really care if the Russians take East Aleppo. Syria is not strategic to the U.S., and I think, you know, we've got to change.
You know, Martin, you know, you're from a regional perspective here, and we have a new, we have Trump coming into office. What are the hopes and what are the fears?
Well, it depends on who you talk to.
Exactly.
On the side of the Saudis or the Iranians.
Exactly.
I think the Saudis were massively disappointed that Clinton didn't come in because they were looking to have some of their former glory restored. But I think it's very interesting that
well, they gave her a lot of money. They gave her. She got a lot of money. They want the payback. Okay, I wonder if they'll get their money back. Okay, I don't know. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, now you're getting onto another CrossTalk show where we should tackle whether the Clinton Foundation should give all this money back. But you know, look, we're in a very, very interesting position. And I think that the worry is that there is a certain careless, a certain maverick approach to handling the problems of these very complicated and complex countries. What we need in the Middle East is we need a new approach which is very pragmatic, which completely slams the door on the old ways, the old polarized setup, and all of the nuances and foibles of the Cold War. We need a new future, a new dawn, and I think perhaps we can have that if Trump is given the right people to work with, and the Russians see this as an opportunity.
Yep.
You know, I mean, the fear is that we make mistakes early on, and I think one of the biggest fears, if you were to talking to the Turks now, or even to some of the to the Gulf states, is what are we going to do about the Kurds? I mean, Ivan touched on this point just earlier on. I think, you know, that's a massive question. You know, I haven't heard anything from the Trump's people about what to do with the Kurdish situation. Hillary Clinton was very for supporting them, giving them more money, bigger guns, and more training. So we could be opening up a new Pandora's box just there. We need pragmatism, and we need sensible people to tackle what are very complicated problems.
Kamal, the same question to you. What are the hopes and what are the fears in the region here? We've already heard about some of the countries there. You want to continue there? Go ahead.
I think there are a lot of fears. I think the fears come from Turkey primarily, what will happen to the Kurdish policy. Because as things stand, basically, Europe and the United States are backing enemies of Turkey in Syria who are allied with the PKK. So that's a big fear for them. There's also hope for Turkey because General Mike Flynn has positively said that America needs to work on Turkey, and Turkey is the #1 priority for US security. I think there's a lot of hope in Damascus that if Trump sticks to what he was saying in the election campaigns, then definitely it's something in the right direction, and he's calling for cooperation with Russia, and he wants to go after radical Islam. I think there's also a lot of fear and hope in Iran. There are a lot of people in DC, in Trump's camp and in New York, who are actually very anti-Iran.
Exactly.
So what does that mean? Because you can't be pro-Damascus and anti-Iran and not mess up the Middle East. So I think there's a lot of confusion. And I think this transition between one president to the other president is full of uncertainty. I think uncertainty like that's never been seen before.
Yep.
And that's where you have a lot of worries. You have a lot of nominees of who will be potential Secretary of States and Defense Secretaries. And I think it's like a revolving door at the moment of who goes into the Trump Tower, who comes out of the Trump Tower. I think wiser heads should prevail. I think the alliance between Russia and Israel in the air corridor is very important. I think cooperation between Russia, Israel and Turkey could be an interesting endgame for Syria as well, because Russia is cooperating with Israel on how to manage the air corridor.
Yes.
And if that does go properly, then that could be a solution coming up. But I really think the main player here has to be
gentlemen,
Moscow, Ankara.
I'm going to jump in here. We very rarely end on a positive note, but I think we did. Many thanks to my guests in Beirut, London, and in Washington. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, CrossTalk rules.
I love it.